Okay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this book discussion on masculinity, consumerism, and the post-national Indian city, streets, neighborhoods, home, with Professor Sanjay Srivastava. Welcome back, Professor Srivastava, to Doing Sociology. Very briefly introducing our speaker, he is a British Academy Global Professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London. His research interests include urban cultures, consumerism, middle-class cultures, and ethnographies of the state. His key publications include Constructing Post-Colonial India, National Character and the Doon School, Routledge, 1998, Passionate Modernity, Sexuality, Class and Consumption in India, Routledge, 2007, Entangled Urbanism, Slum, Gated Community and Shopping Mall in Delhi and Gurgaon, OUP, 2015, and Masculinity and the Post-National City, Streets, Neighbourhoods, Home and Consumerism, Cambridge University Press, 2022. Earlier employed at the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi University, North Campus, he also served as co-editor for the contributions to Indian sociology between 2012 to 2016. His current work explores new land markets in Gurgaon and the relationships they produce between the state, private capital, and newly enriched rural land sellers. He has earlier collaborated on ethnographic films such as Doon School Chronicles and Kotla Walks, Performing Locality. So today we are actually going to discuss his latest book, the one that I mentioned at the beginning itself. So let me welcome Professor Srivastava with a question about the context in which the book is written. If you could talk a little bit about it to our readers.
Thank you, Ritipala, for the invitation. It's always nice to kind of have a bit of time to talk about a publication in some detail. So, I wanted to combine some of my past interests, and the first chapter of the book outlines these interests, which is masculinity, urbanity, and modernity. So, I wanted to combine. Oh, sorry. Combine these three areas of my research interests and things that I've written on. And I'm particularly interested. I've been writing on cities for quite some time now, and as cities are fundamentally defined in research, in general conversation as public spaces, I increasingly began to see cities as needing to be understood in terms of their gender, and in particular masculinity, given that long-standing historical distinction that has emerged, around the world between the private and the public, and there's a gender to this distinction. So if cities are defined as public places, I was interested in thinking about what is the most significant way of understanding cities in terms of how they're socially defined, and that has to be, I think, understanding the masculinity of cities, because I think that's fundamental to how certainly Indian cities and many cities in non-Western contexts have a function, and even in the Western context. So that's the broadest way in which I can define how I came to write the book. And then within that, if I'm going to understand the history of masculinity and how it's linked to cities, I was interested in different contexts, different sites where one can understand this. So one is through nationalism. So the book begins with nationalism, masculinity in the city, and that historically that is a focus on elite masculinity very much, because nationalism, the way I discuss it, because I should also say that I'm focused on very specific spaces, very specific sites through which I explore the relationship between city and urbanity. So the first bit, the second chapter rather, which begins the actual discussion of the book, is on a very specific site, a school. So that was in the nationalism and urbanity and urbanness and masculinity, and how that school, the Doon School, defined itself as an urban space, as distinct from so-called backward rural space, and how did masculinity come into play there. Then I was interested in also to move on to another side of masculinity and urbanism, which is subaltern masculinity. So, there is a chapter on men in the city, subaltern men in the city, which has to do with sort of on how subaltern men understand their place in the city, and again on very specific sites, the sex clinics in Delhi and Mumbai. And then I moved on to another site, which is how city imagined. So I thought, well, what is the really significant side of imagining the city through the framework of masculinity, and that is through a very popular form of reading material, which is Hindi detective novels. So there's a very specific imagination of the city within these detective novels. So I explored that, and then I was interested in something that is very significant. How does one understand, to my mind, in terms of understanding the Indian city now, which is how does one understand the relationship between religion, masculinity, and urbanism? So I was interested in specific sites of urbanism, specific sites of these forms of urbanism, of where, how can one understand masculinity within these contexts? But but then the larger context, of course, as the title of the book suggests, is the rise of something quite new within context of Indian modernity, which is the rise of consumer cultures. So I thought, well, how does one kind of bring in this really significant phase of capitalism within Indian modernity, and that the rise of consumer cultures? How does this help us to understand masculinity and how it relates to class, to caste, to behavior, to the ways in which urban spaces become defined? So these are, some of the ways. And so I should add one more aspect, that I'm very interested in the state. How does the state function? So one chapter also deals with a very significant way in which the state now seeks to define Indian urbanism, which is through technology. So that chapter explores ideas of technology, governmentality, and masculinity, and how does that impact upon how masculinity is defined, and also how women and non sort of masculine subjectivities become defined. So so again, just to go back to my initial comments, I'm interested in masculinity, modernity, and urbanity, and urbanism, if you like. And within that, sub-themes that include ideas of urban spaces, the state, consumer cultures, and the nature of capitalism in the present.
Interesting. And I would want to know from you how you think cultures of masculinity define cities, because this is what you are interested in.
Yeah. But I think cultures of masculinity both define cities and are defined by them, right? But it's a symbiotic relationship. So who does what in an urban space, a public space, is very much an aspect of masculinity. What kinds of bodies can be can and how, what kinds of bodies and how they're distributed in urban space is very much an aspect of masculinity. So, for example, the kinds of bodies that can be exposed to a certain extent are masculine bodies, right? Men will often walk around in certain kinds of clothing, which women can't. What kinds of expressions become a part of urban culture is very much a culture of masculinity. For example, I'll give you some kind of a simplistic example. One of the very interesting things historically always in Indian cities is how easy it is for men to urinate in public spaces. Like even in in the middle of a road, you'll find men urinating, or just pulling up the side of the street and turning their back to the vehicular traffic, and the public disappears, right? So masculinity allows certain kinds of privileged behavior in urban spaces, which very much defines what happens in urban space. And in turn, because that kind of privileged behavior is allowed in urban space, it also defines masculinity as something of urban spaces in a way that I'm not going to call it femininity, because femininity is not the opposite of masculinity, in a way that non-masculine identities are not able to define, are not able to be present, are not able to express themselves in urban spaces. So if you think of behaviors, think of bodies, if you think of occupation of spaces, if you think of the whole idea, there's a term called the rights to the city. And normally that's seen in terms of the poor and the rich, okay? that certain kinds of people have a right to the city and the poor must also have right to the city. But I think we need to break that down in terms of gender, to think of how even, say, poor men, subaltern men, have a greater right to the city than poor women. Okay, so there are different ways that we can understand how uh, uh, masculinities are defined by the city and cities define masculinity, and that requires us to think about multiple registers that indeed that we are concerned in social sciences, which has to do with bodies, that has to do with behavior, that has to do with caste, has to do with class, and it very fundamentally has to do with the symbiotic relationship between urban spaces and men, and the historical distinction that's emerged between the public and the private. So if you bring these together, you can see how everyday acts of being, different kinds of genders, are fundamentally defined in terms of urban spaces by cultures of masculinity. And there have been recently, sort of other books as well. But I think it's quite recent to think of cities as, at least in the Indian context, and I think African context as well, and historically also in the Western context, cities as fundamentally the realm of men. And that's changing very slowly, and that's why it's important to think of masculinity and urbanism.
Right. So, going back to the basics of the book, is it also possible to talk a little bit about the methods that you use to, collect your data and then present it?
Well, I think no anthropologist, no sociologist, or rather, all sociologists, all anthropologists do historical sociology and historical anthropology, right? No one, only, although we may work in the present, all our categories are historicized, and we try and think of what is the history of a particular category, what is the history of this particular line of thought. So my methods are. Um, there's no one particular method that I use, and that's, I think, because, and that is because the present, its complexities don't necessarily lead you to use just one method. So I use archival methods. A lot of my work is in the archives, obviously, fieldwork methods, which is fundamental to the kind of work that I do. I draw from anthropology and sociology. I draw from history. I draw from media studies. I draw from feminist work, feminist studies. I draw from urban studies. I am my method is to think of the contiguities, the relationships that exist between different contexts, say class, caste, urbanism, religion, and then think about what are the most useful frameworks that allow me to think of these in order to produce a coherent narrative. So I don't. That's why I try and I choose multiple methodologies and interdisciplinarity, which is driven by the material that comes to hand, material that's produced. So I don't really have a preconceived way of thinking about how to organize my material, except to obviously think of how does one give it coherence, and that coherence actually comes from what might actually be quite a very scattered methodology, not at all a coherent methodology in any way, because I don't think that trying to work in the present is something that you should do through saying that I have one specific method that is the most important, that's the most significant. I think the strength of anthropology and sociology increasingly is that it allows you to draw on different things, right? Media studies and history and anthropology and whatever else. So one makes sense and tries to give coherence to empirical material, which is fundamental to what I do. Obviously, it's fieldwork based. Through thinking about how have others written about how people think, how have others written about what identities people produce. So that could come from, and that can come from multiple disciplinary perspectives. So I'm quite clear that that there is no one specific method that is suitable to what I do? And it's a question that I guess people often think about, and people often ask, what method should I use? So, and I think seems to me the perhaps the most useful answer is, what does your material ask of you, rather than suggest that there is one particular method that one can use.
I think listening to your response does take me back to our classroom where you taught me observational methods in sociology, and this is very similar to what we were doing in our MPhil coursework as well. Are masculinity and the city historically intertwined topics? How is masculinity connected to colonialism?
Yeah, well, as I say, I mean, I think they're fundamentally intertwined. I don't think you understand cities without understanding masculinity. And they're fundamentally intertwined because the long-standing connection, the division, the binary that has been produced between the private and public is, of course, it's a false binary, right? So the city as a public space is fundamentally linked to what happens in the so-called private space. So what people learn in domestic spaces about gender is very much reproduced in the so-called public space. So city and masculinity are fundamentally linked areas of discussion, linked topics of discussion, and of course there's a history to this, as you just asked, in terms of colonialism. So colonialism was also in very, very significant ways very fundamentally about manhood, about the manhood of the colonizer, and of course the manhood of those who are being colonized. So in essence, a lot of colonialism was a conversation between men, right? So, for example, if you think about the debates about sati, as scholars have pointed out, the debate was between white men and brown men as to whereas the English said this is a very bad practice, sati. The Indian nationalists who responded to it responded in the sense of this being their tradition, so that it wasn't about women at all. It was a conversation between men. So in various ways, colonialism was fundamental to how we understand masculinity. So so how we understand, for example, how the ideas of Hindu men was produced, how the ideas of then Muslim masculinity was produced, how the ideas of colonized masculinity was produced, so that that also provided a justification for colonial rule, and how the discourse of colonialism produced certain ideas of masculinity, which then led the anti-colonial movement to not so much problematize masculinity itself, but to say that actually Indian masculinity is not how the colonizers defined. That is actually, so the colonizers said that Indians are, in inverted commas, effeminate, Indian men are effeminate. The response to that was that's actually not true. It wasn't, the response wasn't, what does it actually mean to say? And why should we even think of something called effeminacy as a negative, right? So colonialism produced very fundamental ideas about masculinity. It defined in many ways Western white masculinity through a relationship that it purported to show with non-Western masculinity. So in many ways, colonialism defined what Western masculinity was, and defined the European identities, European male identity in very significant ways. At the same time that it produced certain ideas of the colonized masculinity of the colonized. So a lot of our responses, Indian national responses, actually had to do with defending rather than problematizing ideas of masculinity. And I think that has carried on for a while. That has then become very significant part of how masculinity in the post-colonial period continued to be understood, and then how cities continue to be understood, and how public spaces continue to be understood as the space of men. And hence, I think that's very strongly linked to violence against women if they are seen to be out of place in public spaces in particular. Okay, and I think that this has a strong colonial trajectory, but of course it is not only a colonial trajectory, it's also a post-colonial context. So in these kind of complicated ways, but relevant ways, there's a strong relationship between colonialism, European masculinity, Indian masculinity, and religion. I mean, colonialism and the anti-colonial movement also produced ideas of what Hindu masculinity and Muslim masculinity. So if Hindu masculinity was seen to be the whole idea of as a weak form of masculinity, and Muslim masculinity was seen to be as a violent form of masculinity, that's very much an outcome of the colonial discourse around masculinity in the colonies and how people responded to it, how Indians, for example, responded to it. And then that in turn becomes very strongly entrenched in Indian thinking in the post-colonial period. And if the post-colonial period, if you think of ideas of spaces, public spaces, then clearly then that those colonial ideas that emerged through the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries become embedded in how we think about cities, who belongs to cities and who belongs to public spaces, who does not belong in public spaces. And of course, fundamental to this is the fact that the public and the private are fundamental, that are completely enmeshed, although we tend to think of the home and the world as different categories of thought, different categories of existence. Clearly, what boys, men learn at home is how it is what produces the public, right? So in those kinds of ways, the history of masculinity, history of recent masculinity is fundamentally linked to how men understood themselves, and in turn, it's also fundamentally linked to how men understood themselves in the city and how men understood cities as well.
Right. And since we are talking about men, do you also address men as gendered beings? I mean, we know women are gendered beings, but what about men?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, so I guess, historically, when people thought of gender or gender studies, it was about women, right? But of course, gender is always a relationship. So if you want to understand the relationship, you need to understand the relationship between different genders. Otherwise, men become just a universal subject, and you continue to operate with the category that men are the universal subject. And then you don't need to understand men as gendered subjects. So again, to understand men as gendered subjects, it's important to understand what are the networks that they're part of. What anxieties surround this gender called malehood? What psychological systems produce this gender called malehood, called maleness? So, in order to understand men also as gendered beings, it is important to understand use the same kinds of categories that have come to us, say, from feminist scholarship, that are used for understanding the situation of women, to apply the same kinds of categories of thinking to men. There's just recently, I think maybe yesterday or today, I was reading an interview with an author. I can't remember from where. And she was asked that, you produce very successful books, and at the same time, you're a mother, you do various other things. How do you manage this? And she said that I politely, that till the same question is asked of a man, I politely refuse to answer that question, because what she was obviously suggesting that if you're going to understand women as gendered subjects, you need to ask the same kind of questions in terms of masculinity. And that's a good way of thinking about, I think, how you think of all gender, all men and women, in fact, all other genders, as socially produced, socially embedded. And that's why I think it's important to think of men as gendered beings. And I think that's what it means to ask questions of men as gendered beings, exactly as the author was saying. She said, I'm not going to answer that question till you ask the same question of a man. How did he, why is this question always asked of women? So yes, I think that's significant to apply the same categories of thought when you're asking questions about masculinity, as you would when you're asking question about women. So I'm deliberate not using the term femininity, because femininity is not the opposite of masculinity, right? How you define femininity, femininity and masculinity are always in a hierarchical relationship. It's not equal and opposites, right? So I think that's one way of answering as to how one looks at men as gendered beings.
A related question: what is the relationship between masculinity and patriarchy?
Well, obviously, the kind masculinity and masculinity in city, the kinds of contexts that I'm interested in, are linked to an understanding that derives from work on feminist scholarship. But one crucial distinction is that where patriarchy is a relationship between men and women that makes all men superior to women, right? Masculinity is also a relationship between men and men. Of course, it's a relationship between men and women, but also men and men. So what kinds of men are seen to be better, superior men? So whereas patriarchy produces all men as superior to, say, women, discourse of masculinity produces certain kind of men as superior not only to women, but to other men. So in that way, there is a difference, although obviously there's a relationship between the two. And an understanding of masculinity has to also engage with an understanding of patriarchy. But I think there is a difference, which also allows us in many fields to think, say, sexuality studies. So why, for example, heterosexual men might be considered as superior men to non-heterosexual men? Why would married men be considered superior to non-married men? So why are unmarried men always treated as children? Why are men who have sons considered superior to men who might only have daughters, right? So masculinity allows for an understanding of all these different kinds of contexts, because masculinity produces a relationship between men such that some men are produced as superior to both men, to both women as well as men. And that's the difference between patriarchy and, I think, masculinity.
Right. And because we are talking about, consumerism and, of course, masculinity, patriarchy, we look at the Indian city as a site of a vigorous culture of consumerism. It's everywhere. But at the same time, there is also a control on women's participation directly in it. How does one look at this juxtaposition?
So that brings me to another idea that I've tried to discuss in the book, which is moral consumption. What happens is that clearly consumerism is a very widespread activity in India for the last few decades, right? And capitalism in principle, doesn't say that certain people cannot participate in its world, right? So consumerism is clearly an invitation for everyone to participate: men, women, whoever, transgenders, everyone, right? However, at the same time, so you have shopping malls, right, which are public spaces, and you have now in shopping malls, we'll have many women, young women, single women, women in groups also wandering around. So you would imagine at one level, of course, that problematizes the idea of women in public spaces. Number one, it also problematizes the idea of the woman as a sacrificer. So if you're a consumer, you are primarily spending on yourself, right? You're doing things for yourself. You're consuming for yourself, right? Whereas historically, of course, one of the steadfast ideas has been the woman as who consumes second, who sacrifice. Okay, and yet you have consumerism as such a dominant activity. So no one, if people don't say, I don't want to buy more fridges, I don't want to buy more cars, I don't want to buy more laptops or whatever, right? Then how does one marry the favorable attitude towards contemporary consumerism and its in principle problematic nature, which is that women can also become consumers and hence in principle be autonomous in very various ways, including going to shopping malls by themselves. And I think one of the things that's happened in the Indian context is the rise of the idea of moral consumption, so that women obviously are uh, 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 enthusiastic participants in the world of consumerism, but there are specific ways, even if you now look at various, say, so-called women's magazines, are full of ads for goods and commodities, certainly in non-English languages, but they're also full of advice on how does one combine this being a person of the world with being a person of the home. So, and that is what I refer to as moral consumption. The consumer, that there's nothing wrong with consumerism, but it must be according to certain Indian ways of consuming, so that one can be of the world, go to the shopping mall, but come back home, figuratively speaking, when required. So I think a lot of the current tension is about how does one deal with this new world that has opened up, where where publicness has also become something that women do. They're also public figures, and consumerism very much a public act. It's also an act of spending on oneself. So how does one combine this with the masculine anxiety that it produces, right? And one combines this with the discourse of moral consumption, with that women, should be allowed access to these acts, which were other. In fact, consumerism historically was very male act, right? Cars, motorcycles, and non-consumerism was a very female act, right? But I think increasingly people deal with their relationship with consumerism, because no one says consumerism is a bad thing, but their relationship with consumerism in terms of gender is through the idea of moral consumption. Women can be consumers, can access public spaces as long as they come back home when required. So with the rise of consumer cultures, you also have the rise of very so-called women-centered religious activities, right? Like Karwa Chauth, for example, where women combine being consumerist subjects with very much being subjects of the home. So there's a discourse of morality and moral consumption, which I think is also a very strong aspect of how cities, in as much as they are spaces of consumerism, are increasingly being refashioned. This tension between consumerism as a public activity, and hence you go out into the city to consume. But what does it mean in terms of masculine anxiety? Because everyone is consuming, women also consuming. And I think the discourse of moral consumption helps to kind of assuage this anxiety. And I think it seems to be quite a significant way in which these anxieties are handled right now.
Right. Also, what are the different sites where masculinity is enacted and it impacts the city as a social agglomeration, so that women's participation is also in question?
Well, I would say almost any site which is a site of sociality. I would have earlier said that only public spaces like clubs and playing fields, but because the public and the private are interlinked, you would have to argue that the way that all sites of sociality are sites of socialization. Okay, so clubs, playing fields, schools, the home are sites where the relationship with the cities is constantly being addressed, fashioned, refashioned, street corners. So if you're thinking of so-called stereotypically public spaces, then obviously, say, playing fields, which are still very much male domains, right? The street corners, which is still places that only men hang around in. It's very rare to see women hanging around unless they have something to do in these particular spaces. Um, you know, Increasingly, given the manner in which cities are changing, so and you have the new forms of governance and governmentality that have emerged. So residents' welfare associations are really strong sites of the manner in which urban masculinity is defined. Even now, in many residents' welfare associations. So now, like in Delhi, in other cities, certainly middle class resident welfare association deal with the state, right? Security, paying taxes, water dues, electricity. A lot of this is done by middle class RWAs. But in the middle class RWAs, the most significant positions that have to deal with, say, finance and security are all occupied by men. So, and women are usually there if you have a I don't know, social activity committee or something similar, right? So these are the various ways in which urban associations help to define what it is to be a gendered being in an urban environment.
How can one understand the relationship between masculinity, urbanity, and religion? And I think this question has become even more important in today's context. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. One of the things historically in most urban literature, sociology, anthropology, the urban was supposed to lead to a decline of religion. Okay, the city was seen as a space where the religion would decline, and it's quite the opposite. In fact, it's not true at all. Not just in Indian context, in many other contexts, even in places like London. Whilst many Christian churches are no longer attended, they have been taken over by other religions. So they've either become Pentecostal churches or they become mosques or whatever. Right. So the religion hasn't declined anywhere in the world, in most cities around the world. So there's a really significant relationship, I think, between masculinity, urbanity, and religion. If you think about now, in North India, for example, there's the Kamariya festival is taking place, right, where um, um, lots of young men, not just young men, increasingly have women also participating on the Kamar pilgrimage, right? And it's a good starting point to think about the relationship between religion, masculinity, and urbanism. So one of the things is to also then think about what the state does in terms of religion, urbanity, and masculinity. So increasingly, cities have become a site of a great kind of flowering, efflorescence, if you like, of religious activities. But also, they've also become a site of defining, if you're thinking only about religion, religious masculinity. So the groups that are allowed to perform their religious activities in public are also able to define themselves as having a greater freedom to express their masculinity. So quite in at least say in North India, there's increasingly pressure for, say, Muslims to not perform public namaz, right? Of course, that pressure does not exist on, say, Hindus, right? But that has also become defined, that's also become expressed as the capacity of men of one religion to be able to express themselves publicly in the way that men of another religion cannot. Okay? So that's one way of thinking about the complex relationship between masculinity, urbanism, and the state, and religion, of course, right? So the city itself, in different ways, in terms of religion and masculinity, is a site of refashioning ideas of masculinity. It is a site of, in as much as it allows certain kinds of religious activities, a site of self-expression on the part of some communities in terms of what they can do, and what others can't do. So masculinity historically has been, of course, very much about the capacity for self-expression as compared to other forms of gender. So now increasingly that has become the capacity of, say, specific religious groups and men within the specific religious groups to be able to express themselves in a space that is defined as the realm of men. So if men of one religion can express themselves in the public realm, and men of another religion are not allowed to express themselves in public realm, then in some ways, those who are not allowed to express themselves in the public realm become, in inverted commas, effeminized. Because, and I put this in inverted commas, obviously, because it's not a term that I'm using in any kind of unqualified sense. So cities are interesting ways, increasingly, where the relationship between religions in India is being played out. They're interesting ways also, interesting because, for example, and here I think the consumerism angle is also important. So if you have really big temples, like the Akshardham temple in Delhi, which is a massive temple on the Yamuna floodplains, you find lots of young women who are there by themselves, right? Who are wandering around and looking at the various attractions there, who are eating by themselves. So it's interesting that the whole idea, the masculine anxiety over whether women should be given access to public spaces is once again assuaged by the fact that a religious space provides women access to both consumerist activities, because Akshardham is very much a consumerist space, right? So all kinds of attraction. There is a film, the big film hall. There are cafes, etc. So it's interesting how religious space like that serves to assuage Hindu masculine identity, which says, which otherwise would be worried if women were in public spaces, by producing a space which is a space of moral consumption, where women can go there because although they are consumerist subjects, they're actually there in a religious space. So there are different ways in which I think religion and the city are intertwined. One has to do with, say, one relationship between men of one religion and men of another religion, and how that produces ideas of Hindu masculinity, Muslim masculinity. And the other is how anxieties around the public presence of women around the presence of women in public spaces can be assuaged. Masculine anxieties can be assuaged by the fact of, say, the ideas of moral consumption, and hence that also helps to shore up ideas of masculinity, that women are sisters and wives or whatever, nieces, although they are in public spaces, they're actually very specifically religiously defined public spaces where they can both be consumers, but they are simultaneously traditional subjects, religious subjects. So the different ways, I think, the relationship between city, masculinity, and religion can be explored.
And in neoliberalism, we do see it as an explanation to a lot of things, not just in terms of masculinity and consumerism. But is it an adequate explanatory framework when we look at the complexity of lifeways, particularly when there is also specific regional forms of capitalism? And how do post-nationalism and moral consumption explain relationships between these older and newer structures?
I mean, clearly there are processes we can identify as neoliberal process, right? For example, the state has outsourced many things to the private sector. The health system has been privatized. People go to private hospitals. Schooling, education is privatized. Universities there are many private universities now where large numbers of people go to. But I suppose my concern is that you can't really use one cause to explain multiple effects. It's a functionalist argument, in other words. And you cannot say that something called neoliberalism explains what happens to universities, what happens in infrastructure, what happens in weddings, what happens in movies, what happens in the health sector. So that what we really need to ask is, of course, to of course admit that there are neoliberal processes, but they don't necessarily produce neoliberal subjects. That although there are neoliberal processes, people, subjects, say, in the Indian context, they are not autonomous, self-autonomous, self-regulating entrepreneurial subject that theorists of neoliberalism suggest is what it is about. In fact, people continue to be embedded strongly in caste, kin, gender, etc. networks. And what does that mean in terms of how do people relate to processes of capitalism? I think for that, we really need kind of regional histories of capitalism. So what we need to ask is, why do people like shopping malls? I mean, apart from social scientists, I don't really come across people in everyday life who say, we hate shopping malls. Why do people send their children to private universities? Why do people like consumerist activity? Why is it that, for example, many young couples from very poor backgrounds love shopping malls? Because it provides them a space of meeting that they do not have access to otherwise in their localities and their homes, etc. So if you're going to understand the new processes of capitalism, those that are increasingly identified as neoliberal, then I think it is dangerous to just use it as a blanket term. So almost anything we don't like, we say it's neoliberal. It's like a big kind of a black hole. And people often use the term neoliberal under the assumption that the reader or the listener knows exactly what it means. And that's not a very useful then concept if you know exactly what I mean and you understand exactly what I'm saying. We need, I think, much more specific histories of capital. We need an understanding of why is it that simultaneously people can be part of economic processes that might be of global scale, but continue to be embedded in local context, caste, skin, gender, ethnicity, religion, that are very much, that can only be understood through empirical work, which then, of course, converts that empirical work into theoretical frameworks. So it is in that sense, I think we need to understand or work with, it seems to me, a framework which says that you can have neoliberal processes, but they don't produce neoliberal subjects. So in Indian cities, for example, of course, there are neoliberal processes, shopping malls and gated communities, etc., etc. But neoliberal processes haven't necessarily gotten rid of what were pre-neoliberal frameworks of either gender or caste or class. They continue to operate in the city. You still have gated communities, for example, there may be no lower caste, no non-upper caste person at all. There may be no Muslims. So we need to understand how neoliberal processes, economic processes, exist side by side with so-called non-neoliberal processes, rather than suggest that something called neoliberalism has completely wiped away what we understood to be a pre-neoliberal framework. That just hasn't happened. It's not productive analytically and just incorrect empirically. And it's in that sense that I was interested in the term post-national, which again, the idea of the nation, but very much embedded in new contexts, say of consumerism. So it's national identity, which is not the same national identity which was produced at the height, say in the immediate post-colonial period, immediately after the end of colonial rule, kind of a Nehruvian colonialism. So post-colonialism allows me to think of local processes that have emerged, but are simultaneously global in nature. So the one does not displace the other. One doesn't kind of, how do we develop frameworks of thinking that allow us to think of kind of entangled contexts without suggesting that something called neoliberalism has completely done away with sort of older frameworks of analysis, older frameworks of which people thought. I don't think that's true at all. And that's why I would very strongly kind of try and operate with the idea that we need to think of how long-standing structures of thought, nationalism, caste, ethnicity, religious identity, continue to exist alongside newer processes of capitalism, without one displacing the other. And what does this mean for our understanding of forms of modernity in the non-Western world, at least?
Right. To end with one last question, do you think your book is a different one from recent works or even earlier works on masculinity?
I think it builds upon many of the things that I have read. It is in as much as, I suppose, in some ways, if you're going to say it's different, if it departs, it's primarily to rethink all the categories of thought through thinking about what's happened in the last couple of decades. So that's why I'm very interested in consumerism. So that's why I'm very interested in combining an understanding of masculinity through consumerist activity. So one of my chapters, for example, is on how men belonging to particularly Hindu organization, although they also produce anti-Muslim rhetoric, it is produced through their understanding of themselves in a new world as consuming subjects, as men with the capacity to be men through having a large choice, the capacity to exercise choice. And that is what consumerism is about. Right? So I guess, I mean, I would prefer to think that I'm, obviously I'm building upon all the works that have been produced on masculinity. But if there are two things I would say which I've tried to do in this book, one is to bring together very explicitly the relationship between masculinity and city, and very explicitly the relationship between how masculinity and identity, how is it very significantly linked to a very important trend of our times, a particular moment in the life of capitalism, which is consumerism. So I guess these are the two ways that I would think that the book is perhaps in some ways maybe a departure, if it is a departure. But certainly, it then has to build upon the scholarship on consumerism, the scholarship of masculinity, and the scholarship on cities. Because I think in some ways, again, masculinity, the masculinity we have now, in some ways it's the same, but it's not the same. Because how men define themselves in the present, it axiomatically has to do with the process of the present. Right? Even how the past is understood can only be through the process of the present. So in that way, I'm interested in consumerism. And in that way, I guess you might argue that this book tries to think of how the present is relevant to an understanding of the present. And that present is very significantly, amongst other things, is this idea of consumerism, and how and also the idea of how the state becomes redefined through the contemporary process of capitalism. So maybe in that way, it's, I guess, I'm somewhat hesitant. I don't think books are a complete departure. They build upon, and they try and bring together different elements that perhaps make for an understanding of their argument as a departure.
Right, that makes so much sense, actually. And thank you so much for this very engaging conversation. I think all your detailed responses are going to let us reflect on these interconnections between urban cultures, consumerism, masculinity, and patriarchy, particularly in the context of what is happening, not just in India, but as you mentioned, in many countries across the world. So thank you once again for taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks. Great talking to you, Ritu Pandas.